South Africa, 1918. Already bearing the scars of decades of unrest, the political climate in the country is in decline. Equality for its people still a distant dream. It is into this South Africa, on the 18th of July 1918, that a boy named Rolihlahla is born, who later became known as Nelson Mandela. Born into the Tembu royal family, he lived in Mvezo, a small rural village in Umtata in the Eastern Cape. Like most young boys, Nelson spent much of his time in the veld playing with the other boys from the village, and at night sharing his blanket and food with the same boys. Nelson learned a great many skills during his years in the veld, from gathering wild honey, fruits and edible roots to catching fish with twine and sharpened bits of wire. Despite both of his parents being illiterate, they ensured that Nelson received an education, sending him to a local Methodist school when he was 7 years old. After completing his junior certificate at Clarkberry Methodist School, Nelson attended Hilltown Methodist Boarding School. He was the first of his family to attend high school and matriculated in 1938, forming part of a very small number of black pupils who attained a high school education in South Africa. Throughout his childhood, Nelson was driven by a thirst for education, which extended into young adulthood. His ambitions for an education led him to starting a BA degree in Fort Hare in 1939. But after a fallout resulted in his return home, Nelson learned that the regent had arranged for him to marry. This caused Nelson and his cousin Justice to flee to the city of Johannesburg. Johannesburg held many promises for Nelson. He was sure of his path. Finding a job and completing his degree would get him everything he wanted. Unbeknownst to him, however, his life would take on a completely different journey. A journey not only of his own self-discovery, but the discovery of the potential South Africa holds. Life in a growing city was not without its challenges. In the first few weeks, Nelson found himself not only between jobs, but also places to live. Eventually, he moved in with his cousin, Garlic, who introduced him to Walter Sisulu. Sisulu, being an influential man, managed to find a job for Nelson at the law firm Witkin, Sidelsky and Edelman, where he could train to become an articled clerk. Nelson began to feel himself drawn into politics, largely influenced by Sisulu and one Khau Hadebe, a friend who Nelson met while working at the law firm. In early 1943, 4 years after starting his degree, Nelson passed and finally achieved his BA through the University of South Africa. Not deterred by the many challenges facing a black student at the time, Nelson went on to start his Bachelor of Law degree at Wits, his sights set on liberating his fellow Africans. The constraints of apartheid weighed heavy on all colored people in South Africa, and Nelson was determined to do his part in helping lift it. Moving to his house in Orlando, a township in Soweto, Johannesburg, Nelson began spending increasing amounts of time with known activists such as Oliver Tambo and Anton Lembede. This manifested in Nelson's participation in the Alexandra commuters bus boycott in August of 1943, a public protest march which successfully prevented a bus fare increase proposed against all colored people. After meeting his first wife, Evelyn Mase, Nelson went on to have 3 children between 1945 and 1947, but tragically lost their second-born to meningitis at 9 months old. In 1947, Nelson decided to pursue his dream of becoming an attorney and opening his own practice by becoming a full-time student. However, he would soon be drawn into politics in a much more active way than before. After the sudden death of Anton Lembede in July of 1947, Peter Mda became the new ANC Youth League president and Nelson was appointed secretary. The election in 1948, when the National Party once again came to power and officially installed the laws of apartheid, spurred the members of the ANC Youth League to action. In response to the immorality and suppression of the governing regime, Nelson and his comrades began advocating direct action against the apartheid government. While Nelson and his colleagues had contributed to the ANC becoming more revolutionary, his studies suffered greatly during this time, eventually resulting in being denied his degree in 1949. In 1950, the apartheid government implemented a Suppression of Communism Act, allowing increased police repression and affecting the actions of all protest groups. In reaction to this, the ANC held a Defend Free Speech convention in March, calling for a May Day stay-at-home strike. While successful, with more than half of the black workforce participating, the day tragically ended with police killing 19 people and injuring 30. As a national day of mourning, the ANC declared the 26th of June Freedom Day. In 1953, having passed a qualification exam, Nelson and Oliver Tambo opened their own law firm operating out of an office in central Johannesburg. After an unsuccessful protest to prevent the forced relocating of all black people from Sophiatown in 1955, Nelson concluded that violent action would need to be taken. A call to all South Africans was made to send in proposals for a post-apartheid era. Based on the responses, a freedom charter was drafted by Rusty Bernstein. Nelson's marriage suffered greatly throughout this period, and by 1958, his divorce from Evelyn was finalized. During the divorce proceedings, Nelson met and started courting his second wife, Winnie Madikizela. They married shortly afterwards in June 1958. His marriage to Winnie brought him another 2 children in 1959 and 1960 respectively. The infamous treason trial began in 1958, which saw 156 people, including Nelson, arrested for treason, lasting all the way to 1961, when the majority of the defendants were found not guilty on the basis of insufficient evidence and were released. The remaining 30 defendants were tried and sentenced for treason. Throughout the trial, Nelson was still working as an attorney, and he attended court proceedings as he was needed. Disagreeing with the multiracial approach of the ANC, in 1959, the Pan-Africanist Congress, or PAC, was formed. The 21st of March 1960 saw the terrors of the Sharpeville Massacre, a non-violent anti-pass campaign arranged by both the PAC and the ANC, which took a turn for the worst when police opened fire on protesters, killing 69 and wounding 180. This brought international condemnation on the apartheid government and resulted in rioting all throughout South Africa. The government responded by implementing a state of emergency and declaring martial law, as well as banning the PAC and ANC. Disguised as a chauffeur, Nelson traveled incognito around the country organizing the new structure of the ANC, holding secret meetings with journalists, as well as organizing the mass stay-at-home strike in 1961. He believed that the ANC should form an armed group to channel some of the violence in a controlled direction. This led to the founding of Umkhonto weSizwe, a militant group with Nelson as one of its chairmen. Despite being separate from the ANC, it quickly became known as the party's armed wing. MK, as the group was known, planned to carry out acts of sabotage, which would exert maximum pressure on the government, but with minimal casualties. On the 5th of August 1962, a tip-off from the CIA resulted in Nelson's arrest. He was charged with incitement and leaving the country without a passport, after he had traveled to neighboring countries for military training. Nelson was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. It was while he was serving this sentence that a raid at Lily's Leaf Farm, where Nelson had resided for a long time and held many MK meetings, brought into light paperwork which documented the activities of MK, many of which mentioned Nelson by name. And so began the Rivonia trial, held at the Pretoria Supreme Court in October 1963. 11 defendants, including Nelson, were charged with 4 counts of sabotage and conspiracy to violently overthrow the government. Once again, Nelson used the political stage to help further the freedom movement, turning his focus from his defense to his condemnation of the court as illegitimate. He argued that the laws in place were draconian and that defying these laws was justified. In place of taking the stand as a witness, where he would be subject to cross-questioning, he made a final statement in the form of his 3-hour "I am prepared to die" speech. On June 12, 1964, Nelson and 2 of his co-accused were found guilty on all charges and were sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend the next 18 years of his life as a prisoner on Robben Island. Section B, a cell measuring 2.4 by 2.1 meters, a straw mat to sleep on. Life in prison for Nelson was a set routine consisting of waking up, cleaning your cell, meals, daily inspections by the guards, physical labor, showers in cold seawater and bed by 8 p.m. Monotony was a daily inevitability. Working in the grueling conditions of the lime quarry, being denied basic health and safety equipment while doing so. Nelson believed that strong convictions were the secret to surviving. In a powerful display of strength, managing to endure through the many atrocities that were thrown at him. In his determination, Nelson sought to complete his Bachelor of Law degree, knowing that it could only help his current situation, studying during the evenings via the University of London. He even initiated the University of Robben Island, with prisoners lecturing on their respective areas of expertise. Nelson also studied Afrikaans. He had hoped to build mutual respect with the wardens so as to convert them to his cause. Nelson was visited by various officials. Most significant of the visitors was the Liberal parliamentary representative Helen Suzman of the Progressive Party. She championed Nelson's cause outside of prison. Nelson suffered a huge loss in 1968 with the death of his mother, and yet another one just a year later when his firstborn son, Tembi, died in a car accident. Nelson was forbidden from attending either funeral. Winnie was rarely able to see him as she was regularly imprisoned herself for political activity.
We are going to dismantle apartheid physically in this country.
Winnie was released from prison in 1977 but was forcibly settled in Brantford and remained unable to see him. In March of 1980, a journalist, Percy Oboza, started the slogan "Free Mandela," which sparked an international campaign that led the UN Security Council to call for Nelson's release. Unfortunately, despite the increasing foreign pressure, the government refused. The early 1980s brought about an escalation in violence across the country, and many people predicted civil war. Pressure was placed on the government and on Botha by numerous banks as well as Margaret Thatcher to release Nelson. In 1985, Botha offered Nelson a release from prison on condition that he rejected violence as a political weapon. Nelson rejected with a reply, "Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." Nelson became seen globally as a heroic figure, amassing an international collective of supporters, all campaigning for his release. Unfortunately, Nelson was facing personal problems when he was informed by ANC leaders that Winnie had set herself up as the head of a gang, the Mandela United Football Club, which had been responsible for torturing and killing opponents, even children, in Soweto. Though many encouraged Nelson to divorce her, he decided to stay loyal to her until she was found guilty by trial. After suffering a stroke in 1989, Botha stepped down as leader of the National Party, though he would retain the state presidency. He was replaced by F.W. de Klerk. De Klerk was instated as state president 6 weeks after Botha had invited Nelson to a meeting in July 1989. De Klerk considered apartheid unsustainable and released a number of ANC prisoners. Due to health issues, Nelson had been moved to Victor Verster prison, where he met with the newly instated de Klerk. It was after this that all formerly banned political parties were legalized in February 1990, and Nelson's unconditional release was announced. Leaving the Verster prison on 11 February, Mandela held Winnie's hand in front of amassed crowds and the press. The event was broadcast live across the world. The days that followed had Mandela staying at Desmond Tutu's home, where he met with friends, activists and the press, giving a speech to an estimated 100,000 people at Johannesburg's Soccer City.
I have spoken about freedom in my lifetime. Your struggle, your commitment, and your discipline has released me to stand before you today. Let not a single hair, not a window be broken when you leave this place. Africa! Hallelujah! Amandla!
The years leading up to the next election, which was to be the first all-inclusive official democratic election in the history of South Africa, had Mandela touring around the world. He encouraged foreign countries to support the sanctions that had been imposed against the apartheid government, as the fight was not over yet. He met various leaders of nations in his travels, including George H.W. Bush, Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher. In May of 1990, Mandela led a multiracial ANC delegation into preliminary negotiations with a government delegation of 11 Afrikaner men. He impressed them with his knowledge of Afrikaner history, and the negotiations led to the Grote Skeer Minute. This led to the government lifting the state of emergency. In August, in a move criticized by MK activists, Mandela offered a ceasefire known as the Pretoria Minute. Mandela moved into Winnie's large Soweto home, but their marriage was under a lot of strain. Though he supported her throughout her trial for kidnapping and assault, by April 1992, he publicly announced his separation from Winnie. She was in prison at the time, having been found guilty of her crimes. After this, Mandela moved into the mostly white suburb of Houghton in Johannesburg. December 1991, Mandela attended the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, where he took to the stage after de Klerk condemned the ANC's violence and denounced de Klerk as the head of an illegitimate, discredited minority party. The second CODESA, as it was known, was held the following year. These meetings were held in order for all political parties to sit together and figure out what the new South Africa would look like.
No majority should ever be able to misuse its power, to undermine the Constitution, or to dominate or to damage the interests of minorities, however that may be defined. A common practical goal which is materializing is that we need a CODESA-inspired and negotiated transitional or interim constitution. And that from that will result a democratically elected transitional multi-party government, which will govern in a spirit of national unity.
Why do we put off till tomorrow solutions that we can reach today. The people cannot postpone their hunger. Similarly, they do not want their freedom postponed. Where can we claim...
The negotiations were long and tiring, but eventually a moderately common ground was met. Following the assassination of Chris Hani, Mandela made a public speech to calm the rioting. Soon after this, he appeared at a mass funeral in Soweto for Oliver Tambo, who had died of a stroke. The CODESA negotiations continued, but the democratic process was temporarily threatened on 25 June 1993 when the RVB attacked the Kempton Park World Trade Center. The date for the election was set for 27 April 1994. As leaders of the two major parties, de Klerk and Mandela appeared on a televised debate. Though de Klerk was widely considered the better speaker at the event, Mandela's offer to shake his hand surprised him. This handshake led commentators to deem it a victory for Mandela. All of his work and campaigning led to a relatively peaceful election in April, where the ANC had a sweeping victory, taking 63% of the vote, which was just short of the two-thirds majority needed to unilaterally change the constitution. The ANC was victorious in 7 provinces, with Inkatha and the National Party each taking 1. Mandela's vote was cast at the Uhlange High School in Durban. Though the victory assured his presidency, he publicly accepted that the election had been marred by instances of fraud and sabotage. The first act that the newly elected National Assembly was to perform would be to formally elect Mandela as the first black chief executive of South Africa.
And I accordingly take great pleasure in announcing the election of Comrade Nelson Mandela to the post of President.
Mandela's presidency lasted only 4 years, but it was his choice to serve for only 1 term in office. His inauguration took place in Pretoria. It was televised to over 1 billion viewers globally. This event was attended by 4,000 guests, including a multitude of world leaders. In keeping with earlier agreement, both de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki were given the position of deputy president. Though Mbeki was not his first choice, he grew to rely heavily on him throughout his presidency, allowing him to shape policy details. At the age of 76, Mandela was not a young man anymore and faced various ailments. As was his nature, he continued to exhibit a lot of energy, but he felt isolated and lonely. Despite his opulent surroundings, Mandela lived simply, donating 1/3 of his 552,000 annual income to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, which was founded in 1995. That same year, Mandela entered into a relationship with Graça Machel, who was the widow of former Mozambican President Samora Machel. They had first met in July 1990, and their friendship grew into a partnership over the years. They finally married in July 1998. Mandela having organized a wedding for his 80th birthday. In 1997, Mandela stepped down as the president of the ANC, with Thabo Mbeki as his replacement. Mandela first gave retirement a try in 1999. However, shortly after found the seclusion difficult, quickly reverting back to a busy public life involving daily tasks, meetings with world leaders and celebrities, founding the Nelson Mandela Foundation, as well as focusing on rural development, school construction, and combating HIV/AIDS.
The number of reported cases of AIDS is on the increase. At the local level, it must be ensured that AIDS education and contraception, particularly condoms, are readily available.
One of his major achievements was the 46664 campaign against HIV/AIDS. At the age of 85 in 2004, Mandela announced that he was retiring from retirement and retreated from the public life on a "don't call me, I will call you" basis. He retained some involvement in international affairs, but mostly met only with close friends and family. His 90th birthday was marked across the world, with the main celebrations being held in Kunu and a concert in his honor in Hyde Park, London. In a speech marking the event, Mandela called for the rich to help the poor across the world. Mandela's final public appearance was during the 2010 Soccer World Cup, which he successfully campaigned for in 2004. Mid-2013, Mandela was hospitalized for lung infection in Pretoria. He had suffered various respiratory ailments since 2011. During the year, he was in and out of hospital, and though there was a successful medical procedure performed, the condition did not resolve. After being readmitted to hospital in June, he was released in September 2013, although his condition remained unstable. Mandela died on 5 December 2013 at the age of 95 at around 8:05 at his home in Houghton, surrounded by his family. 10 days of national mourning were proclaimed, with 8 December being a national day of prayer, followed by a memorial service on 10 December at the Johannesburg FNB Stadium. His body lay in state from 11 to 13 December at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, after which a state funeral was held on 15 December in Kunu. Approximately 90 foreign state representatives traveled to South Africa to attend the memorial service, all forms of media being overwhelmed with tributes. Though he may not be with us anymore, his legacy will remain with this country forever. He may not have been born into a free world, but he worked tirelessly to ensure that he would leave one. His ability to bring people together, his calm under pressure, and his ever-smiling nature will forever be remembered by the world, but more importantly, by his people, the people of South Africa.